Welcome to BookBound Audio. Sit back, relax, and let us guide you into the world of eerie whispers and forgotten pacts with the Ashwood Coven. Step into 1962 New England as Elliot Brooks, a renowned private detective, and Miguel Vasquez, his loyal companion, unravel a spine-chilling mystery of curses, fire, and vengeance. Prepare for a journey through shadowy truths, ancient rituals, and paranormal echoes, as this thrilling tale grips you till the very last word. The train station was far too quiet for a weekday. I had just stepped off the 2:15 from Boston, my leather satchel bumping against my side as I descended the platform stairs. The usual hum of townsfolk gossiping over benches or the occasional scuffle of impatient commuters was replaced by an uneasy silence that even the crows perched high above seemed unwilling to break. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of smoke, faint yet persistent. Harlan County had seen its fair share of factory incidents, but this was different. It was the smoke of something more intimate, something wrong. Elliot Brooks was waiting for me at the corner of the station, his silhouette unmistakable even in the overcast light. Leaning against the lamppost, he looked every bit the archetypal detective with his overcoat draped casually over his shoulders and his hat tilted low. His sharp, piercing gaze met mine, and though he managed a faint smirk, there was no disguising the tension behind it. "Right on time, Miguel. I swear you could set a clock by that train," Elliot said as I approached, his voice as dry as ever. "And yet, I suspect you're not here to compliment my punctuality," I replied, matching his tone. He extended a hand, and as I shook it, I noticed the slight tremor in his grip. It wasn't fear. Elliot Brooks didn't frighten easily. No, this was something else. Something urgent. "There's been another fire," he said, his words clipped. "And it's not just the fire. Symbols carved into the siding of the houses. You'll want to see this." As we walked toward his car, a sleek black sedan that had seen better days, Elliot filled me in. The first house to burn down belonged to the Wilkins family, upstanding members of this town. No history of arson, no signs of foul play, until, of course, they found the strange markings on what remained of the front door. Now, another home had caught fire 2 days later, and the symbols had reappeared, this time etched into the porch beams. "It's got the locals spooked," Elliot said as he drove, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Half of them think it's vandals, the other half think it's the devil himself." "And you?" I asked, studying his profile. He didn't answer right away. "I think we're dealing with something old," he said finally. "And old things, Miguel, don't go away quietly." The house in question was a modest 2-story on Elm Street, its charred remains standing stark against the dull gray sky. Fire crews were packing up as we arrived, their jackets smeared with soot and exhaustion etched into their faces. The scent of wet ash and burnt wood was overwhelming, stinging my eyes and clinging to the back of my throat. Elliot led the way, flashing his badge to the officer stationed at the perimeter. "This is my colleague, Miguel Vasquez," he said. "He's consulting on the case." I raised an eyebrow at the term colleague but didn't protest. The officer, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, nodded and stepped aside. As we crossed the threshold into the wreckage, the temperature seemed to drop, and a shiver ran down my spine. Whether it was the chill of the damp ruins or something more, I couldn't say. The symbols were immediately apparent. Carved with meticulous precision, they adorned the door frame, the porch beams, even the scorched remnants of a windowsill. Circles intersected with jagged lines, triangles filled with runes that I couldn't decipher offhand. They were neither crude nor decorative. These symbols had purpose. I pulled a notebook from my satchel and began sketching the patterns, my hand steady despite the unease settling in my chest. Elliot stood nearby, his arms crossed as he observed the scene with his usual intensity. "Recognize any of it?" he asked. "Not yet," I admitted. "But they're too deliberate to be random. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." As I worked, a figure approached us from the edge of the property. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, her hands clutching a shawl around her shoulders despite the mild weather. She looked to be in her late 40s, though the lines etched into her face suggested she'd aged more in the past week than in the past decade. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice trembling. Are you here about the fire?" Elliot nodded, stepping forward. "Mrs. Hensley, I presume." She nodded, her eyes darting between us. "They said you'd be coming." I don't know what to do. First the Wilkinses, now us. My husband says it's just bad luck, but I know better. I've seen those marks before. I straightened at her words. "You've seen them before?" I asked, stepping closer. She hesitated, then nodded. "Years ago, when I was a girl. My grandmother's house had those same carvings. She used to tell me stories, awful stories about witches and curses. I never believed her. Not until now." Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Elliot placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his tone gentle but firm. "We're going to figure this out, Mrs. Hensley. But we'll need your help. Anything you can remember, anything at all, could make a difference." She nodded again, her composure fragile but holding. "There's a box," she said. "Upstairs in what's left of the attic. It belonged to my grandmother. I think it might have something to do with this." Elliot exchanged a glance with me. "Let's take a look," he said. Navigating the charred remains of the house was treacherous, but Mrs. Hensley insisted on leading us. The attic was little more than a crawl space, its ceiling blackened and sagging in places. She pointed to a corner where a small wooden chest lay half buried under debris. Together, Elliot and I cleared the rubble, lifting the chest out with care. It was heavy, its metal fittings tarnished with age. The lid creaked as Elliot pried it open, revealing its contents: old photographs, yellowed letters, and a leather-bound book with a clasp that resisted our attempts to open it. "That's her journal," Mrs. Hensley said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She always kept it locked. Said it was for our own protection." Elliot held the book up, studying it with a frown. "We'll need to find a way to open this," he said. "If it holds any answers, we can't afford to ignore them." As we descended the attic ladder, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking among the ruins, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive weight of the air and the faint, acrid scent of smoke. Outside, Elliot handed the journal to me. "Think you can make sense of this?" he asked. "I'll do my best," I replied, though I couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Whatever we were dealing with, it was far beyond the realm of anything I had encountered before. As we returned to the car, Mrs. Hensley stood on the porch, her shawl fluttering in the breeze. Her expression was one of quiet desperation, as if she knew that we had only just begun to scratch the surface of a much darker truth. Elliot started the engine, and as the car rumbled to life, he turned to me with a grim look. "This is just the beginning," he said. "And something tells me it's going to get worse before it gets better." I nodded, clutching the journal tightly in my hands. The symbols, the fires, the whispers of curses and witches, all of it swirled in my mind like the smoke that still lingered in the air. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain: we were in for a fight. The crackling fire in Elliot's study filled the room with a warm, flickering glow, but the aura it offered was far from comforting. The leather-bound journal sat on the mahogany desk between us like an uninvited guest, its dark cover seeming to absorb the light as though to guard its secrets. I had spent the better part of the night poring over the symbols I sketched at the Hensley home, hoping for clarity. Yet, the answers remained elusive, locked behind the journal's stubborn clasp and buried in the whispers of Calum County's guarded history. Elliot stood at the window, his silhouette framed by streaks of rain trailing down the glass. His expression was unreadable, but I could sense the weight of the case pressing on him. For once, he had no quips or dry humor to offer. His silence mirrored my own unease. "Do you think she was telling the truth?" I asked finally, my voice breaking the spell of quiet. Elliot turned, his sharp gaze meeting mine. "Mrs. Hensley?" "She has no reason to lie," he replied, rubbing his temples. "It's the rest of the town I don't trust." I knew exactly what he meant. Calum County was a place of hushed voices and sideward glances. Despite its charming storefronts and pristine white church steeple, there was a lingering shadow that no amount of fresh paint or well-tended gardens could dispel. If there were answers to be found here, they would not be offered willingly. We spent the morning probing the town, Elliot's instinct leading us to the spots where locals gathered to trade gossip, or, in our case, avoid it entirely. The diner on Main Street was bustling with chatter and the clinking of coffee mugs, but conversations hushed as we walked in. I could feel their eyes on us, the weight of their stares almost palpable. Elliot ordered 2 coffees from the counter, while I scanned the room for familiar faces. At a corner booth sat Harold Leland, the town's mailman and resident busybody. If anyone knew the whispers making their rounds in Calum County, it was Harold. "Let me guess," Harold said, his lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You two are here about those fires." Elliot slid into the booth across from him, leaving me to take the seat next to him. He didn't answer Harold's question directly, opting instead to stir his coffee with deliberate slowness. "Strange thing about those fires," Elliot said after a pause. "They don't seem random. And those carvings on the houses, any idea what they mean?" Harold chuckled nervously, glancing around the room as though checking for eavesdroppers. "I don't know anything about symbols, Mr. Brooks. But I can tell you this much: things like this don't just happen out of nowhere." I leaned forward, unable to hide my curiosity. "What do you mean?" Harold scratched his chin, his gaze darting to Elliot as though to gauge whether he should continue. "It's the history of this place," he said finally. "Calum County's got roots deeper than most people care to admit. Not just the soil, mind you, the stories, the bloodlines. You ever heard of the Ashwood family?" My pulse quickened at the name, but I kept my voice steady. "Mrs. Hensley mentioned them. She said they were tied to the Salem trials." Harold nodded, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "That's right. But what she didn't tell you is that the Ashwoods weren't just accused. They were rumored to have made a pact, a blood oath with something not of this world." Elliot stiffened slightly, his fingers tapping against his coffee mug. "Rumored by who?" "By anyone brave enough to keep talking after the trials were over," Harold replied grimly. "The Ashwoods may have gone to the gallows, but their curse didn't die with them. It spread through the town, through the families tied to them. Some say it lingers to this day." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the weight of Harold's words settling heavily. Do you believe it? I asked, watching him closely. Harold hesitated, then shrugged. Doesn't matter what I believe. What matters is that the fires aren't done, and neither is whatever caused them. If you want to know more, you'll have to dig deeper than me. Elliot leaned back, his expression betraying nothing. Then we'll be in touch, he said, rising from the booth. Harold seemed almost relieved as we left, his tension visible even from across the room. We spent the afternoon combing through archives at the town hall, the damp air doing little to dispel the sense of unease clinging to us. Old photographs, faded census records, and handwritten notes filled the files, offering glimpses into Carlem County's past. Miguel Vasquez was not a name tied to this place, but my outsider's perspective seemed both a boon and a curse. The deeper we delved, the clearer it became that the town's secrets weren't just buried, they were hidden deliberately. Elliot pulled a photograph from one of the files, holding it up to the light. It was black and white, the edges worn from age. It showed a group of people standing in front of a church, their expression solemn. In the background, barely visible, was a symbol etched into the stone wall, one of the same carvings from the houses. This, Elliot said, pointing to the symbol. This isn't coincidence. I nodded, my mind racing. What does it mean, though? Why now? Elliot shook his head. That's what we need to find out. As the sun began to set, we found ourselves drawn to the edge of town, where the ruins of the first burned home still stood. The air here was heavy, almost oppressive, and the scent of smoke lingered despite the rain. I couldn't help but feel that we were being watched, though the empty streets offered no sign of movement. Elliot knelt beside the charred remains of the porch, his gloved hand brushing against the scorched wood. There's something here, he murmured. Something I can't put my finger on. I joined him, my eyes scanning the wreckage for clues. It was then that I noticed something, a faint outline in the dirt beneath the porch. A symbol, barely visible but unmistakable. Elliot, I said, my voice trembling. Look at this. He turned, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied the mark. Another carving, he said. But why here? Why the porch? I didn't have an answer, but the weight of the discovery was undeniable. The symbols weren't random, they were a pattern, a puzzle waiting to be solved. And whatever was behind them wasn't done. As we returned to Elliot's study that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something far larger than ourselves. The journal, the photographs, the symbols, they were pieces of a story that Carlem County would rather forget. But the truth, as Elliot often said, had a way of surfacing whether people liked it or not. And this truth, I suspected, was far from kind. The journal had proven stubborn. Elliot's attempts to pry open the clasp with a small screwdriver had yielded no results, and I doubted brute force would fare any better. It seemed almost as if the lock had been designed not just to deter the curious, but to actively resist them, another mystery laid upon the growing enigma of Carlem County's secrets. After another fruitless attempt, Elliot slammed the journal down on his desk, muttering a curse under his breath. His frustration was understandable. We were chasing shadows, grasping at fragments of truth that felt tantalizingly close but remained just out of reach. We need a key, I said, though the obviousness of the statement did little to help. Or something that can bypass it. Elliot shot me a look that was equal parts skepticism and annoyance. And where do you suggest we find that, Miguel? Magic store down the block. His sarcasm aside, I couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was the linchpin of this case, the thread that could unravel everything. The symbols, the fires, the whispered tales of curses, all of it seemed tied to the words locked away within its pages. If we were going to make progress, we had to unlock it. But the journal wasn't the only thing demanding our attention. Another fire had been reported that morning, this time on the outskirts of town, in a ramshackle farmhouse that had stood empty for years. The property owner, a reclusive farmer named Chester Reardon, had been away during the fire but arrived to find his land consumed by flames. Like the other sites, symbols had been found etched into the wood, and Chester was desperate for answers. Elliot called ahead, arranging to meet Chester at the site. The drive was long and winding, taking us deep into the countryside where the landscape turned wild and untamed. The farmhouse, or what was left of it, sat at the end of a dirt road bordered by dense, overgrown woods. As we approached, the charred remains came into view, the air thick with the acrid scent of burnt timber. Chester was waiting near the driveway, his wiry frame hunched against the cold. He looked like a man worn thin by life, his clothes threadbare, his hands rough and calloused. But there was a sharpness in his eyes, a flicker of defiance that suggested he wasn't ready to give up just yet. "Mr. Reardon," Elliot said, stepping out of the car. "Thanks for meeting us." Chester nodded, his gaze shifting to me. "Who's this?" he asked bluntly. "Miguel Vasquez," I replied, extending a hand. "I'm helping Mr. Brooks with his investigation." Chester hesitated, then shook my hand with a grip that felt more like a test than a greeting. Satisfied, he gestured toward the farmhouse. "Not much left to see, but you're welcome to take a look." The ruins told a familiar story, walls reduced to skeletal frames, ash and debris scattered across the floor. But as we stepped inside, something caught my eye. Among the wreckage, a single beam remained intact, its surface unmarred by flames. Carved into its wood was a symbol, intricate and precise, yet unmistakably menacing. "Another one," I said, tracing the lines with my finger. The wood felt oddly cold, as though it had been untouched by the heat of the fire. Chester's eyes narrowed as he watched me. "You know what it means." "Not yet," I admitted. "But it's not random. Whoever carved this knew what they were doing." Elliot took a photograph of the symbol, his camera clicking sharply in the silence. "Did you notice anything unusual before the fire?" he asked, turning to Chester. Chester hesitated, scratching his head. "Couple nights ago, I thought I saw someone near the woods," he said finally. "Figure in a dark coat, just standing there, watching." I called out, but they didn't move. Just disappeared into the trees. Elliot exchanged a glance with me, his expression grim. "Any idea who it was?" Chester shook his head. "No. But I don't think it was anyone from around here." The woods seemed to press closer as Chester spoke, their dark canopy suffocating the light. I felt a shiver run through me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. There was something about this place, something ancient and watchful, that set my nerves on edge. We spent the next hour combing through the wreckage, searching for clues that might shed light on the fire's origins. As Elliot pieced together fragments of evidence, I kept my focus on the symbols, sketching them in my notebook and noting their placement. Each one seemed deliberate, part of a larger pattern that I couldn't yet decipher. Before we left, Chester pulled Elliot aside, his voice low and urgent. "I don't know what's happening here," he said. "But it's not natural. People talk about curses and witches like it's fairy tales, but I'm telling you, there's something evil in those woods. You do well to stay away." Elliot didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the tree line. Finally, he nodded. "We'll do what we can, Mr. Reardon." As we drove back to town, the weight of Chester's warning lingered in the air. Elliot remained silent, his jaw set in determination, while I sifted through my notes, searching for connections. The fires, the symbols, the figure in the woods, it all pointed to something far older and darker than either of us had anticipated. When we returned to Elliot's office, the journal awaited us like a silent challenge. I opened my satchel, pulling out the photographs and sketches we had collected. Together, we laid them out on the desk, piecing them together like fragments of a puzzle. "It's not enough," Elliot said, his frustration evident. "We're missing something, something vital." I nodded, though the answer eluded me as much as it did him. The journal's lock stared back at us, its clasp unyielding, as though taunting us with the secrets it held. And as the fire crackled softly in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not just by the town, but by something far more sinister. Cullen County had secrets, and it was clear that uncovering them would come at a cost. The question was, how high? Elliot's office had become a fortress of unsolved riddles, each document and artifact another brick in the wall that encased us. The journal still lay unopened on the desk, its clasp mocking us with silence. Elliot paced the room, his movements restless yet purposeful, while I studied the sketches of symbols now scattered across the table. The faint hum of the fire in the corner provided little comfort, its warmth felt distant against the cold grip of dread clawing at the edges of my mind. "We need leverage," Elliot said abruptly, his voice cutting through the quiet. He turned to me, his sharp gaze unrelenting. "Someone in this town knows more than they're letting on. We've been tiptoeing around the edges, but it's time we start pushing." I didn't disagree. The town had been reluctant to share its secrets, but withholding those secrets had come at a cost: another fire, another symbol, another mystery buried beneath ash and smoke. If we were going to make progress, we'd need more than sketches and theories. Elliot's plan became clear as he grabbed his coat and gestured for me to follow. Our destination was an old Victorian house perched at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its exterior worn but undeniably regal. Inside lived Eleanor Ashwood, the last surviving member of the infamous Ashwood family. If anyone could shed light on the curse, it was her. The drive was tense, neither of us speaking much. The Victorian loomed larger with every turn, its silhouette framed by the skeletal branches of barren trees. When we arrived, Elliot didn't hesitate. He marched up the steps and knocked firmly on the door. I followed, my heart pounding in time with the echo of his knock. Eleanor Ashwood answered almost immediately, as if she'd been expecting us. She was old, older than I'd imagined, with thin grey hair pinned neatly back and sharp eyes that belied her frail frame. Her gaze swept over Elliot first, then lingered on me, sizing us up before stepping aside to let us in. "You're here about the fires," she said without preamble, her voice steady despite its tremor of age. It wasn't a question. Elliot nodded, removing his hat as a gesture of respect. "We are, Mrs. Ashwood. And we believe your family's history may hold some answers." She led us to a sitting room filled with antique furniture, its walls lined with faded portraits and bookshelves that sagged under the weight of their contents. The atmosphere was heavy, as though the house itself bore the weight of its occupant's legacy. Elliot wasted no time. "Do you know what these symbols mean?" he asked, pulling out the photographs and laying them on the coffee table. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression unreadable as she studied the images. After a long pause, she sighed and sat back. "They are warnings," she said. "Marks left by those who seek to control what should remain bound. My family's curse is not just our burden, it is this town's. I exchanged a glance with Elliot, then asked the question that had been gnawing at me. How did it start? Eleanor's eyes darkened, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It started with fear. During the trials in Salem, the Ashwoods were desperate to protect themselves from accusations. My ancestors sought power in places they shouldn't have, rituals, pacts, blood oaths sealed with promises they couldn't keep. When the covenant was broken, vengeance followed. And it has followed us ever since. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Elliot leaned forward, his tone firm but not unkind. How do we stop it? Eleanor hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a photograph on the table. It was old, its edges frayed, showing a group of women gathered around a circle of stones. At the center of the circle was a figure shrouded in shadow, their presence almost palpable despite the graininess of the image. To stop it, she said finally, you must restore the balance. The covenant was broken, and until it is repaired, the fires will continue. Elliot didn't flinch. What does that entail? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. Her gaze shifted to me, her expression softening. You are not of this town, she said. And yet, you stand here seeking its truth. Why? I felt my throat tighten, her question catching me off guard. I study history, I said, my voice steady despite the rush of emotions behind it. Myths, folklore, the stories people try to forget. And this town, your family's legacy, is one of those stories. Eleanor nodded, as if satisfied by my answer. Then remember this, Mr. Vasquez, history is not kind to those who dig too deep. Her warning sent a shiver down my spine, but before I could respond, Elliot stood, his movements sharp and deliberate. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Ashwood, he said. We'll do what we can. As we left the house, the weight of Eleanor's words settled heavily on my shoulders. The covenant, the curse, the warnings, they weren't just relics of the past. They were alive, breathing, watching. And as we stepped into the cold evening air, I couldn't help but feel that our steps were being followed. Elliot remained silent during the drive back to town, his focus unwavering despite the growing tension. When we reached his office, he set the journal on the desk once more, its clasp still unyielding. We're not done, he said, his voice resolute. Whatever it takes, we'll find the key. I nodded, though my thoughts remained scattered. The fires, the symbols, Eleanor's warnings, they were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. But one thing was certain, the Ashwood Coven's legacy was far from over, and we were standing at its center. As the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in the room had grown darker, their edges sharper. And as Elliot worked tirelessly to piece together the fragments, I couldn't help but wonder if we were unraveling something that had been meant to stay buried. The darkness had teeth tonight. It bit into the edges of the town, devoured the dim halos cast by street lamps, and sank its sharpness into every corner of Elliot's office. The cluttered desk had become the battlefield for our theories, photographs, sketches, and fragments of burned wood strewn across its surface. Yet the answers remained elusive, like shadows retreating from the touch of light. Elliot was unusually quiet, his focus locked onto the journal clasped in his hand. There was an intensity about him, as if he were wrestling with the secrets it held through sheer willpower alone. I poured myself another cup of coffee, hoping the sharp bitterness would keep my thoughts clear. This case was beginning to unravel more than just the mysteries of Cullen County, it was creeping into the fragile corners of our sanity. A knock at the door broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange urgency, like the breath of someone running out of time. Elliot set the journal down and strode to the door, his movements sharp and deliberate. Standing there was Deputy Hank Monroe, his face pale and strained beneath the glow of the porch light. Hank was the sort of man who wore his authority loosely, more caretaker than enforcer in this quiet town. But tonight, he looked worn thin, like he'd been staring into the abyss for too long. "There's been another fire," Hank said, his voice low and clipped. "Out near the Ashwood property." Elliot's jaw tightened, and without a word, he grabbed his coat and hat. I followed, my pulse quickening as we stepped into the cold night air. Hank led the way in his squad car, its red lights flashing silently against the encroaching dark. The Ashwood property was a sprawling stretch of land on the outskirts of town, a place that carried the weight of centuries. Eleanor had mentioned it briefly, though her words had been veiled with caution. It was a place tied to the Covenant, its soil heavy with the echoes of forgotten rites. When we arrived, the scene was chaos. Flames still licked at the blackened skeleton of the barn, casting eerie shadows across the fields. Firefighters worked tirelessly to contain the blaze, their faces grim under the flickering light. The air was thick with smoke, acrid and suffocating, mingling with the muffled cries of distant voices. Elliot approached the perimeter, his badge enough to grant us passage. I followed close behind, the heat of the fire pressing against my skin. Among the ruins, the symbols appeared again, carved into the beams that refused to succumb to the flames. They seemed to pulse with a strange energy, their edges glowing faintly in the flickering light. I pulled out my notebook, sketching the symbols as quickly as my trembling hand would allow. They were familiar now, etched into my mind like scars. Yet their meaning remained just out of reach, taunting me with their silence. "Same patterns," I said, my voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "But they're deeper this time and more intricate." Elliot nodded, his gaze fixed on the symbols. "It's escalating. Whoever's doing this, they're getting bolder." Hank joined us, his face lined with worry. "Mrs. Ashwood's inside the house," he said, gesturing toward the main building beyond the barn. "She refused to leave. Said it wasn't safe." Elliot's expression darkened. "Not safe from what?" Hank hesitated, then shook his head. "She wouldn't say. Just kept muttering about shadows in the fields." The house was eerily quiet as we approached, its windows dark despite the blaze raging nearby. Elliot knocked firmly, his voice steady as he called out to Eleanor. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing the frail figure of the Ashwood matriarch. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, but there was a fire in her gaze that matched the chaos outside. "Mrs. Ashwood," Elliot said, his tone calm but firm. "You need to leave. It's not safe here." Eleanor shook her head, her grip tightening on the doorframe. "This is my family's land," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I won't abandon it, not now." Elliot exchanged a glance with me, then stepped inside, his presence commanding yet unobtrusive. I followed, the weight of the house pressing against my senses. It wasn't just the history that lingered here, it was something alive, watching from the corners. Eleanor led us to a room at the back of the house, its walls lined with shelves of books and artifacts. At the center of the room was a table, its surface covered with more symbols, drawn in ink, carved into wood, burned into fabric. They seemed to hum faintly, their presence tangible in the suffocating air. "This is where it began," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The covenant was made here, sealed in blood and shadow." Elliot stepped closer, his gaze sharp. "And it's breaking." Eleanor nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for an old, tattered book. She opened it to a page marked with a ribbon, revealing a sketch of the symbols we had seen at every fire. But this time, they were part of a larger pattern, a circle surrounded by intricate lines and runes. "It's a binding circle," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But it's incomplete. The fires, these symbols, they're part of the ritual to restore it." Elliot studied the page, his jaw tight. "Restore it to what?" Eleanor hesitated, then met his gaze. "To balance. To vengeance. To justice." Her words sent a chill through me, their weight pressing against my chest. Elliot remained composed, his focus unwavering. "How do we stop it?" Eleanor sighed, her gaze shifting to the window where the flames danced in the distance. "The covenant can only be repaired by those who broke it. But their blood is gone, and their shadows remain. You'll have to confront them." Elliot didn't flinch, his resolve as unyielding as the clasp on the journal. "And where do we find them?" Eleanor's gaze darkened, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "In the fields. In the fire. In the shadows." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the roar of the blaze outside grew louder. Elliot turned to me, his expression grim yet resolute. "We're running out of time, Miguel. Let's move." As we left the house, the darkness seemed to close in, the shadows pressing against the flickering light of the fire. And as Elliot led the way toward the fields, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking straight into the jaws of whatever had been watching us all along. The field stretched out before us like a void, the tall grass swaying ominously in the wind. The light from the fire behind us cast flickering shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with minds of their own. As we made our way deeper into the darkness, every step felt like a challenge to some unseen force, a dare to whatever lingered here to show itself. Elliot led the way, his lantern cutting a narrow path through the gloom. I followed close behind, the notebook in my hand feeling almost laughably inadequate against the overwhelming weight of what we were walking into. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke, tinged with a metallic sharpness that made my skin crawl. "Stay close," Elliot said without turning, his voice steady but low. I didn't respond, but I tightened my grip on the notebook and adjusted the strap of my satchel. The symbols we'd seen carved into beams and etched into fabric had begun to form a clearer picture in my mind, though I still couldn't grasp their full meaning. They spoke of something ancient, something that didn't belong in the world as I knew it. The land grew wilder as we walked, the grass giving way to patches of bramble and gnarled trees that reached skyward like skeletal hands. It was a stark contrast to the cultivated fields nearer to town, as if this part of Carlem County had been abandoned by time itself. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant echo of a bird's call, sounds that felt misplaced, almost artificial in their clarity. Elliot stopped abruptly, raising the lantern to illuminate a clearing ahead. At its center stood a circle of stones, their surfaces covered in moss and faintly glowing carvings. The air around them seemed heavier, charged with an energy that pressed against my chest like an invisible weight. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in time with the rhythm of the lantern's flicker. The stones formed a perfect ring, their symmetry both beautiful and unsettling. Within the circle, the grass was shorter, its edges burned as if scorched by some unseen flame. At the center lay the remains of what could only be described as a ritual, a scattering of bones, fragments of cloth, and symbols drawn into the dirt. I knelt to examine the carvings, their lines sharp and deliberate despite their apparent age. They matched the symbols from the barn, the farmhouse, and every other fire we'd investigated. But here, they were connected, forming intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with a faint glow under the lantern's light. "Elliot," I said, my voice trembling. "These symbols, they're part of a binding ritual." Elliot crouched beside me, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "And it's incomplete," he said, gesturing to the gaps in the pattern. "Whoever's doing this, they're trying to restore it." I nodded, my throat dry. The Covenant Eleanor had spoken of, it wasn't just legend. It was alive, woven into the fabric of this land, its echoes resonating through time. And the fires, they were the pieces being moved to complete the game. As I sketched the patterns into my notebook, I felt the weight of the clearing pressing down on me. The air was thick with something unspoken, something watching. My hands trembled as I worked, but I forced myself to focus, each stroke of the pencil a defiance against the fear clawing at the edges of my mind. Elliot stood, his gaze fixed on the tree line beyond the clearing. "Someone's here," he said, his voice sharp. "I can feel it." I froze, my pulse racing. The shadows beyond the lantern's glow seemed to shift, their edges blurring as if refusing to stay still. Elliot reached for the revolver at his hip, his movements deliberate and slow. The rustle of leaves broke the silence, followed by the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. I turned, my grip tightening on the notebook, and saw the figure emerge from the darkness. Their face was obscured by a hood, their movements fluid and unnervingly calm. "Stay back," Elliot said, his revolver steady in his hand. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond immediately. They stepped closer, their presence pressing against the edges of the lantern's glow. When they finally spoke, their voice was low and resonant, carrying an unnatural weight. "You shouldn't be here." The words hung in the air like a challenge, their meaning clear despite their simplicity. Elliot didn't flinch, his focus unwavering. And neither should these fires. The figure tilted their head, their movements unnervingly smooth. "The fires are not for you to stop. They are for balance. For justice." Elliot took a step forward, his revolver never wavering. "Justice for what?" The figure's silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of their cloak. Finally, they raised a hand, gesturing toward the circle of stones. "For the Covenant. For those who broke it." I felt the breath catch in my throat, the words sinking into my chest like weights. Eleanor's warnings, the symbols, the fires, they weren't just echoes of the past. They were the consequences of actions long buried, now clawing their way to the surface. "Who broke the Covenant?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure turned to me, their presence overwhelming despite the distance. "Those who sought power beyond their grasp. Those who made promises they could not keep." Elliot's jaw tightened, his stance unyielding. "And what do you gain by restoring it?" The figure's response was simple, yet chilling. "Balance." The weight of their answer pressed against me, the clarity of its meaning undeniable. The fires, the symbols, the rituals, they weren't random acts of violence or chaos. They were part of a larger truth, a truth that didn't care for the lives caught in its path. Elliot didn't move, his revolver steady as he spoke. "We need to know how to stop it." The figure hesitated, their movements betraying nothing. "You cannot stop what was broken. You can only choose to repair it." Their words sent a shiver through me, the weight of their meaning sinking in. Repairing the Covenant, it wasn't just about stopping the fires. It was about restoring something far older, far darker, and far more dangerous. Before Elliot could respond, the figure turned, their movements dissolving into the shadows. The darkness swallowed them whole, leaving the clearing eerily silent. Elliot lowered his revolver, his gaze sharp as he scanned the tree line. "We're running out of time," he said finally. "And we're running out of options." I nodded, my hands trembling as I closed the notebook. The Covenant, the fires, the shadows, they weren't just pieces of a puzzle. They were part of a story that refused to stay buried, clawing its way back into the world whether we liked it or not. And as we stepped away from the circle, the weight of the clearing pressed against my chest, its silence echoing the question that lingered in my mind: what price would we pay to stop it? The moon hung low and swollen in the sky, its silver light washing over the fields like a pale shroud. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and something sharper, something metallic and unnatural. Elliot walked ahead, his lantern swinging at his side, its flickering glow casting long shadows that danced and twisted as though alive. I followed closely, my heart pounding in rhythm with the crunch of our boots against the earth. The clearing where we had found the circle of stones loomed ahead, its edges marked by twisted trees that seemed to reach for the sky with skeletal fingers. The air felt heavier here, charged with an unseen energy that pressed against my chest and made my breath come shallow. "We're close," Elliot said, his voice low and steady. He didn't look back, his focus fixed on the path ahead. I tightened my grip on the notebook tucked under my arm, the pages filled with sketches and notes that felt increasingly inadequate in the face of what we were walking into. The symbols, the fires, the rituals, they were pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together, their edges sharp and jagged, cutting into the fragile fabric of reality. As we stepped into the clearing, the circle of stones came into view, their surfaces glowing faintly in the moonlight. At the center of the ring, the ground was scorched and barren, the remnants of rituals past etched into the dirt like scars. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, as though the clearing itself were alive and breathing. Elliot raised his lantern, the light illuminating the stones and casting eerie shadows that stretched across the ground. He stepped closer to the circle, his movements deliberate and unyielding. I followed, my pulse quickening as we crossed the invisible threshold that marked the boundary between the ordinary and the otherworldly. The air grew colder, the wind carrying whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They were soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder as we approached the center of the circle. Words mingled with the whispers, fragments of a language I couldn't recognize yet felt disturbingly familiar. Elliot stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed on the stones. "We're not alone," he said, his voice barely audible. I scanned the shadows beyond the circle, my eyes straining to catch any movement. The darkness seemed to shift and pulse, its edges blurring as though refusing to stay still. And then, from the shadows, they emerged. Figures cloaked in darkness stepped into the clearing, their movements fluid and unnervingly calm. Their faces were obscured by hoods, but their presence was undeniable, pressing against the edges of the lantern's glow with a weight that sent a shiver down my spine. They moved to surround the circle, forming a ring that mirrored the stones, their silence deafening. Elliot's grip tightened on the revolver at his side, his posture tense but controlled. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the tension that hung in the air. One of the figures stepped forward, their movement smooth and deliberate. They stopped at the edge of the circle, their hooded face tilting slightly as though studying us. When they spoke, their voice was low and resonant, carrying an unnatural weight that seemed to echo in the depths of my mind. "We are the keepers of the Covenant," the figure said, their words chilling in their simplicity. Elliot didn't flinch, his focus unyielding. "And these fires? These symbols? Is this your doing?" The figure didn't answer immediately, their silence stretching uncomfortably. Finally, they raised a hand, gesturing to the circle of stones. The fires are the echo. The symbols, the key. The covenant must be restored. The words hung in the air like a challenge, their meaning clear despite their cryptic nature. My throat tightened, the weight of the moment pressing against me like an invisible force. The fires, the symbols, the rituals, they weren't just acts of chaos or vengeance. They were part of something far older and far darker. Elliot stepped closer, his movements deliberate. And how do you propose to restore it? The figure tilted their head, their presence overwhelming despite the distance. Balance requires sacrifice. Blood must answer for blood. Elliot's jaw tightened, his revolver steady in his hand. And what happens to the town? To the people caught in your path? The figure's response was simple yet chilling. The town carries the weight of the covenant. Its people are the heirs of its promises. To restore balance is to restore them. The weight of their words pressed against me, the clarity of their meaning undeniable. The fires, the symbols, the rituals, they weren't just acts of violence. They were part of a process, a restoration of something ancient and unforgiving. Elliot didn't move, his gaze sharp as he spoke. And what happens if we stop you? The figure's silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of their cloak. When they finally spoke, their voice carried an edge that sent a shiver through me. You cannot stop what was broken. You can only choose to repair it. Their words echoed in the clearing, their weight pressing against my chest like a physical force. The covenant, the fires, the shadows, they weren't just pieces of a puzzle. They were part of a story that refused to stay buried, clawing its way back into the world whether we liked it or not. As the figures began to chant, their voices blending with the whispers of the wind, the energy in the clearing seemed to shift, growing heavier and more oppressive. The symbols on the stones glowed brighter, their edges pulsating with a light that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Elliot didn't flinch, his revolver steady as he stepped into the circle. We need answers, he said, his voice firm. And we're not leaving without them. The figure at the center tilted their head, their presence almost suffocating. The answers lie within the circle, they said. But once you enter, there is no return. Elliot's gaze didn't waver, his resolve unyielding. Then we'll take that risk. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the weight of his words sinking into my chest like stones. The circle of stones wasn't just a boundary, it was a gateway, a threshold between worlds that carried the weight of centuries. And as Elliot stepped forward, his lantern illuminating the path ahead, I followed, the notebook in my hand trembling with the enormity of what we were walking into. The air inside the circle grew colder, the whispers louder, and the symbols brighter. The figures chanted, their voices blending with the wind, creating a sound that felt both otherworldly and deeply human. And as we stood at the center, the clearing seemed to pulse with an energy that defied explanation, its presence pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. The circle had come alive, its stones glowing brighter with each passing moment, their symbols pulsating with a rhythm that seemed to resonate in the depths of my mind. The energy grew heavier, the chanting louder, and the presence of the covenant undeniable. And as the circle closed around us, the weight of its truth pressed against my chest, its whispers echoing in the depths of my mind. Balance requires sacrifice. Blood must answer for blood. And the covenant must be restored. The air inside the circle seemed to grow colder with each passing second, and the chanting of the hooded figures rang louder in my ears. It wasn't just the volume that unnerved me, it was the rhythm, the way it pulsed like the heartbeat of something alive, something ancient and unforgiving. Elliot stood beside me, his revolver steady in his hand, though I could feel the tension radiating from him. The glowing symbols etched into the stones pulsed faintly, casting an eerie light that illuminated the clearing. The figures moved with fluid precision, their chanting seamless as though carried on the wind itself. Their presence was oppressive, pressing against my senses like a physical weight. And yet, there was a strange familiarity to their movements, a rhythm that seemed to echo in the depths of my mind. Elliot's gaze shifted to me, his voice cutting through the din. Miguel, stay sharp. We need to figure out their next move. I nodded, clutching the notebook tighter in my hand. My sketches and notes felt laughably inadequate against the enormity of what was unfolding before us. The symbols I had drawn, the fragments of meaning I had pieced together, they were all part of a larger story that was still shrouded in shadow. The chanting grew louder, the energy in the clearing heavier, as the figures moved closer to the circle's edge. Their movements were deliberate, yet unyielding, as if guided by an unseen force. The ground beneath our feet seemed to hum faintly, its vibrations resonating in my chest. Elliot stepped forward, his revolver pointed toward the closest figure. Enough games. Tell us what you want. The figure tilted their head, their hooded face obscured but their presence undeniable. Their voice was low and resonant, carrying a weight that sent shivers down my spine. What we want is balance. What we demand is sacrifice. Elliot didn't flinch, his resolve unyielding. Sacrifice for what? The figure raised a hand, gesturing toward the glowing stones. For the Covenant. For justice. For the restoration of what was broken. I felt the breath catch in my throat, the clarity of their meaning sinking in. The fires, the symbols, the rituals, they weren't just acts of chaos. They were deliberate steps toward a goal that defied understanding, a process that demanded payment in blood. Elliot's jaw tightened, his revolver steady. And what happens to the town if we refuse? The figure's response was simple yet chilling. Refusal is not an option. The covenant was broken, and balance must be restored. The cost has already been set. Their words echoed in the clearing, their weight pressing against my chest like an invisible force. I tightened my grip on the notebook, my thoughts racing. The covenant wasn't just a legend, it was alive, woven into the fabric of this land, its echoes resonating through time. The chanting reached a crescendo, the energy in the clearing peaking as the symbols glowed brighter. Elliot didn't move, his gaze fixed on the figures with a sharpness that mirrored the revolver in his hand. Miguel, he said, his voice steady but urgent. Start piecing this together. What do we need to do? I nodded, my hands trembling as I flipped through the notebook. The sketches and notes seemed to blur before my eyes, their edges sharp and jagged like the puzzle they represented. The binding ritual Eleanor had described, the circle, the symbols, the balance, it was all part of the covenant. And if we were to restore it, we would need to understand it. The chanting softened, the figure standing still as though waiting for our next move. I felt their presence pressing against me, their silence louder than their words. The air grew colder, the edges of the clearing blurring as though reality itself was shifting. Elliot's gaze remained fixed on the closest figure, his revolver unwavering. Miguel, now. I forced myself to focus, my thoughts racing as I pieced together the fragments of the ritual. The binding circle, the symbols, the sacrifices, they were part of a process, a restoration of balance that demanded payment in blood. But it wasn't just the stones or the rituals that held the key, it was the people. The covenant had been made by the Ashwood family, but its echoes had spread through the town, binding its people to the pact. To restore the balance, to repair the covenant, we would need to confront its origin, its broken promises, its shattered truths. The chanting resumed, softer now but no less oppressive. The figures moved closer, their presence pressing against the edges of the circle. Elliot didn't move, his resolve unyielding as he stood his ground. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but steady. The binding circle, it's incomplete. The fires, the symbols, they're part of the process to restore it. But it's not enough. The closest figure tilted their head, their hooded face seeming to study me. What do you propose? My thoughts raced, the weight of their question pressing against me. The symbols, the rituals, the sacrifices, they were all pieces of a story that demanded an ending. And as I stepped closer to the stones, their glow intensifying, I realized what had to be done. I turned to Elliot, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at the edges of my mind. We need to complete the circle. The covenant, it demands balance. And to restore it, we have to face the cost. Elliot's jaw tightened, his gaze sharp as he studied me. What are you saying, Miguel? I met his gaze, my chest tightening as I forced the words out. The symbols, the sacrifices, they're part of the process. But the circle isn't just about payment in blood. It's about choice. And if we don't make that choice, the fires will keep burning. Elliot didn't respond immediately, his grip on the revolver tightening. The chanting grew louder, the energy in the clearing heavier, as the figures moved closer to the stones. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the clearing itself were alive and breathing. I stepped into the circle, my pulse racing as the symbols pulsed brighter. The figures watched, their presence overwhelming, as the chanting reached a crescendo. The weight of the clearing pressed against me, its whispers echoing in the depths of my mind. Elliot followed, his revolver steady but his movements deliberate. The circle seemed to hum with energy, its edges glowing faintly as though reacting to our presence. The figures stood silent now, their chanting replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to echo through the clearing. The stones pulsed brighter, their symbols glowing with a rhythm that resonated in the depths of my mind. The energy grew heavier, the air colder, as the weight of the covenant pressed against me. And as we stood at the center of the circle, the cost of redemption became clear. Balance requires sacrifice. Blood must answer for blood. And the covenant must be restored. The clearing surged with a force that defied description. The air around me seemed to hum with life, each beat pulsating in my chest like an unrelenting drum. The figures stood still now, their chanting replaced with silence as the glowing symbols etched into the stones burned brighter than ever, casting an unnatural light across the barren ground. The tension was suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the covenant pressing against my very bones. Elliot was beside me, revolver still drawn, though his focus had shifted to the stones themselves. He stood like an immovable pillar, his hat casting a shadow over his face in a surreal, pulsing glow. I wanted to speak, wanted to break the silence, but the words caught in my throat as the overwhelming energy of the clearing reached its peak. The figures in the cloaks began to move again, their fluid and synchronized motions creating a rhythm that seemed to ripple through the earth itself. They stepped back from the circle's edge, their movements deliberate as they created space for us, space that felt like a challenge, an invitation to step deeper into the darkness. Elliot didn't hesitate. He moved forward, his revolver steady in his hand. I followed, my heart pounding as we crossed the invisible threshold that separated the circle from the world beyond. The ground beneath my feet felt warm, almost alive, and I could feel the symbols beneath the soles of my shoes pulsing faintly with a rhythm that matched the throbbing in my chest. The leader of the cloaked figures tilted their hooded face toward us, their presence suffocating in its intensity. When they spoke, their voice was low and resonant, carrying an edge that cut through the unnatural silence of the clearing. "You stand at the edge of truth," the figure said. "Beyond this circle lies the cost of the Covenant. Are you prepared to face it?" Elliot didn't flinch, his gaze sharp and unwavering. We didn't come this far to turn back. I felt my pulse quicken, the enormity of his words sinking in. The circle wasn't just a gateway, it was a crucible, a place where the weight of history pressed against the present. The cost of redemption wasn't just about restoring balance, it was about confronting the scars left behind by the Covenant. The figure raised their arms, their motions fluid and deliberate as the glowing symbols on the stones pulsed brighter. The ground beneath us hummed louder, its vibrations growing stronger as the clearing seemed to come alive. The hooded figures began to chant again, their voices blending into a harmony that carried an unsettling beauty, resonating in the depths of my mind. Elliot moved closer to the center, his revolver still drawn but his posture shifting. He wasn't just the sharp-eyed detective I had known for years, he was someone standing at the precipice of a truth that refused to stay buried. I tightened my grip on the notebook in my hand, its pages filled with fragments of understanding that had led us to this moment. The chanting reached a crescendo, the symbols glowing so brightly now that they illuminated the clearing as though it were bathed in moonlight. The leader of the figures stepped forward, their hooded presence towering over us as the energy of the clearing surged with a force that made my knees tremble. "The Covenant demands sacrifice," the figure said, their voice cutting through the harmony of the chanting. "Blood must answer for blood." Elliot's jaw tightened, his gaze sharp as he stood his ground. "What kind of sacrifice?" The figure tilted their head, their hood obscuring their face but their presence suffocating. "The bloodline of the Ashwoods remains in this town, tied to the broken Covenant. The fires are their legacy, and their blood is the cost." The weight of their words pressed against me, the truth sinking in like lead in my chest. Eleanor's warnings, the fires, the symbols, they weren't just echoes of the past. They were the consequences of promises broken, clawing their way back to the present in search of payment. Elliot didn't respond immediately, his revolver steady but his stance shifting. I could see the tension in his frame, the battle between his instincts and the overwhelming weight of the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "And if we repair the Covenant?" he asked. The figure's response was simple yet chilling. "Balance will be restored. The fires will cease. But the cost remains." I felt my throat tighten, the enormity of their meaning sinking in. The fires weren't just chaos, they were payment, echoes of a covenant that refused to stay silent. To stop them was to face the cost of restoration, a cost that carried consequences far beyond the clearing. The chanting softened again, the energy in the clearing growing heavier as the stones pulsed brighter. The leader of the figures raised their hands, their presence towering over us as they spoke again. "The choice is yours." Elliot turned to me, his gaze sharp yet softened by the weight of the moment. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. We had come this far, faced truths that had clawed their way from the shadows of history, and now stood at the edge of a decision that would reshape everything. I nodded, my chest tightening as I stepped forward. The glowing stones pulsed brighter, their energy pressing against my skin as I knelt in the center of the circle. Elliot followed, his movements deliberate as he stood beside me, his revolver lowered but still in hand. The chanting grew louder again, the figures closing in as the energy of the clearing surged to its peak. The ground beneath us trembled, the symbols glowing so brightly now that they seemed to burn into the air itself. The weight of the covenant pressed against me, its truth sinking into the depths of my mind. Elliot reached out, his hand steady as he placed it on my shoulder. I met his gaze, my chest tightening as the energy of the clearing pressed against us. Together, we faced the cost, the weight of redemption, the price of balance. And as the symbols pulsed one final time, the clearing erupted in light, its energy surging through the air with a force that took my breath away. The chanting stopped, replaced by silence as the hooded figures stood still, their presence fading into the shadows. The glowing stones dimmed, their light flickering before fading entirely, leaving the clearing bathed in the pale silver glow of the moon. The weight of the covenant lifted, its echoes replaced by an eerie stillness that settled over the clearing. Elliot stepped back, his movements deliberate but unsteady, his revolver still in hand. I followed, my notebook trembling in my grasp as the enormity of what had just happened sank in. The fires had ceased, their legacy replaced by silence. The symbols were gone, their glow extinguished. And as Elliot and I stepped out of the clearing, the weight of the covenant remained, a story that refused to stay buried, its scars etched into the fabric of Calum County. The moon hung low in the sky, its light casting long shadows across the fields. The air was still, the wind carrying whispers that seemed to fade into the distance. And as Elliot and I walked away from the clearing, the truth lingered, the cost of redemption, the weight of balance, and the echoes of the Ashwood Coven. And so, the covenant was restored, but the scars remain, a haunting reminder of the cost of redemption and the weight of truth. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey into the eerie depths of the Ashwood Coven. We hope this tale lingered with you, just like the whispers of Calum County. If you enjoyed this gripping story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to BookBound Audio. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned for our next captivating tale, where the extraordinary meets the haunting unknown. Until next time, happy listening.